Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for being here today. We are going to get started in a couple minutes after we give some other folks a chance to join. For everyone who's just joining us, we're going to get started in a couple minutes once some more folks have had a chance to show up and join us.
Okay.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. And welcome to the hashtag StandUpFG event for educators on Latinx student activism in the classroom as part of the ongoing Oregon Educators Unconference on Public Space and Memory. I'm Victoria Sundell, head of integrated learning at Five Oaks Museum, and I'm joined today by Israel Pastrana, who will be speaking to us. We will be recording this program. Feel free to turn your cameras on or leave them off, whichever is your preference, but please do stay muted. Those buttons can be found at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to use the chat box for comments throughout the event, and we will save time for Q&A at the end of the talk. A little bit about the unconference that's going on. Questions about memory and public space, history, politics, and art have become particularly vital in recent years. Oregon museums and cultural organizations have collaborated to support educators across disciplines and grade levels by curating a resource guide and holding a series of online and in-person programs, including this one, on how to integrate into your teaching the question, how do we use public space to remember? And I will share the link in the chat for the rest of the resources, and in case you want to check those out later. As we begin this event, we encourage you to stay in your body and connect with your breath. Our bodies are part of the land and ecosystems of the earth. Five Oaks Museum rests within a valley bounded by mountains and shaped by a slow-moving river. The river bends and curves and loops around. The river does not hurry, yet the river persists. Within this valley are also wetlands, oak trees, and all of the bodies and creatures that have always lived here. This is unceded Kalapuyan land. Since time immemorial, Kalapuyan knowledge and lifeways have embodied the truths that this land holds. Native people have always been here, are still here, and will continue to be here. The museum, our collection, and the building that houses them were created by and for settlers and their belongings. For those of us who are guests on this land, we acknowledge that the harms of settler colonialism and extractive modes of taking are legacies which our work must account for and reckon with as we seek to enact justice. The Five Oaks Historic Site is a grove of oak trees situated near the museum that has been a gathering place for over 500 years. This site holds the complex and intersectional sense of place and community identity that our work aspires to. We honor all of these things with our presence here at this time, and with our shared work at Five Oaks Museum. Now we'd like to share a little bit about the Guest Curator program. The Guest Curator program at Five Oaks Museum was created to decentralize the museum's singular authority and voice in storytelling. Instead, the curation and storytelling of all major exhibitions is in the hands of our community members, who can speak about their own history and experiences the most authentically. The museum provides the platform from which truthful, multi-sided stories can be told with support from our staff and from our cultural resources. In this session, Israel Pastrana, 2021 History and Culture Guest Curator at Five Oaks Museum and PCC History Professor, will share about the upcoming online exhibition, #StandUpFG, and the Museo Ambulante Walking Museum, and how to connect with Latinx youth activism in the classroom. And like I mentioned, his presentation will be followed by time for Q&A. A little bit of his background before I turn it over to him. Israel is a Chicanx historian and educator from the San Diego-Tijuana borderlands. His teaching practice employs place-based pedagogical approaches that center the history and lived experience of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. In 2018, Pastrana worked with student activists to form Portland Community College's Ethnic Studies program. We're so excited to hear from you today and learn more about the upcoming exhibition and how to bring it into the classroom. Right, I'll turn it over to you, Israel.
Hey, muchas gracias. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you for that lovely introduction and also for the beautiful acknowledgement. I also want to thank Victoria because she designed and created the logo for this exhibition. And so if you've gotten a chance to see the really beautiful Black cutout, right, that was Victoria's work. And I'm really grateful for her contribution to the project. I'm also really grateful to THPRD, as well as the Forest Grove City Council, both of which have provided generous funding for this program, and in particular for the Museo Ambulante that I'll talk about a little bit at the end. So really grateful for their support as well. But lastly, and probably most importantly, I'm grateful to students. The students, those who participated, whether it was in Forest Grove or elsewhere in the walkouts and later ended up in my classroom, students who entrusted me with their stories and support me in this effort to try to tell a student-centered narrative about what it is that took place, first at Forest Grove, but then spreading out across the state. That in some ways is my connection to all of this, right? I arrived in Portland in 2016. In fact, I arrived in May, right as the walkouts were taking place. In many ways, this was kind of my introduction to living in Portland, is seeing this beautiful collection of students come together to stand up for one another and to really press for some important demands in the educational system that I'll talk a little bit about at the end. Those students, when they arrived in my classroom at PCC, they were prepared to make some really pressing changes there as well. They had lived experience, organizing, and had a way of thinking about their place in the relationship to power and authority that had been shaped by their participation in the walkouts. The question that I want to kind of grapple with today, though, is this big question about how we use space to remember, and in particular, how we can use space to remember the walkouts that took place in 2016. And my sense is that we all have a kind of baseline understanding of those walkouts. Started at Forest Grove. The original impetus for students organizing is a banner that is hung by a student that read, "Build a Wall." The following day, students mobilize and begin to organize the walkout on social media using the hashtag StandUpFG. Part of what I talk about in the exhibition text is the longer history of that hashtag, as well as the longer history of racism and discrimination experienced by students at Forest Grove High School. And that's a history that goes back generations. So perhaps an important place to start thinking about this relationship between memory and place and thinking about StandUpFG and this movement is by acknowledging that Latinx students in Oregon had for a long time been fighting up, standing up against discrimination, racism, et cetera. Should be sharing a PowerPoint, and I remember now that I haven't done that. Give me just 1 second. Ahí vamos, there we go. Hey, beautiful image. The students who participated in the walkout in 2006 understood that they were part of a longer legacy of Latinx and Chicanx student activism in the state, right? And so included in the exhibition are a series of photographs that I've taken from the Oregon State University's Multicultural Archive. These photographs are of walkouts or demonstrations led by students at Oregon State University. The images on the far left are of a protest that took place in January of 1995. And the context for those protests, of course, is California's Proposition 187, a really repressive anti-immigrant law that was passed by the California State Legislature, and was also my introduction to activism, right? As a fourth grade student, I participated in a walkout organized by my teachers, similarly protesting this draconian immigration law in the state of California. I'll talk about some of these, one of these images in a little bit more detail, this image here in the center in just a second. The middle column and the right column speak to walkouts that took place in 2005. We can tell that by this here, note 4437. That's a reference to the Border Protection, Anti-Terrorism, and Illegal Immigration Control Act of 2005, which passed the House but was rejected in the Senate, and which resulted, or rather stimulated, massive protests against this immigration bill. And so part of what I want to show with these images is that when students walked out in 2016, they were participating in a legacy that went back generation. And then in fact, right, in 1995 and in 2005 and again in 2016, right, we see different generations of students standing up to defend their communities against racism, against discrimination, and against xenophobia, right? So again, it's important to think about the StandUpFG movement in this longer context, or in this longer history of Latinx youth activism in Oregon. So I said I wanted to hone in on just one of these images, and it's from the 1995 protest. I love this image for a lot of reasons. I love the way that it shows intergenerational activism, right? We see this man here, older gentleman, and in the back, we see children participating in the march as well. We also see this beautiful banner that shows North and South America and a ship coming from England, as well as a reference to Yolanda Lopez's 1979 political poster, Who's the Illegal Alien Pilgrim? And so, part of what I want to show here is how these ideas and these images from the Chicana movement of the 1970s and the 1980s get recycled, get repurposed, right, in 1995, and they show up again in 2016. And part of the reason for that is because the youth who participate in these actions are intimately aware of the connections that they share with the historical past. Right? Students understand that connection to history. They articulate it in lots of different ways. Here in 1995, they're articulating it by using these visual symbols that harken back to an earlier moment. In 2016, Latinx students at Forest Grove High School and other high schools in the region also acknowledged this connection to history. And part of what I find so inspiring about the work of these youth is that they understood both that their actions were historical, that what they were doing was literally making history, as Sergio Bucio acknowledges on the tweet on the left, but they also understood that they were part of a much longer legacy that reached back to that Chicano movement. And so this tweet on the right, I think, is a beautiful articulation of those connections and of that legacy between the past and the present, right? In other words, these students, their actions, their organizing are deeply informed by the past. And they have a very deep knowledge and understanding of that history, whether or not that history is valued in the classroom, right? And that's something that students will have something to say about a little bit later. So I like this concept of making history. I think it's a useful way of thinking about what it is that the students are doing, both in describing their connections to the past, as well as in articulating the historical impact of their own actions. Another concept that I find really useful in thinking about the actions of students is this concept of a constellation of struggle. And I borrow that phrase from Gay Teresa Johnson, who's a professor of Black Studies at UCLA. And she wrote a book which was published in 2013 by the University of California Press. The title of the book, which I'm happy to link to, is called Spaces of Conflict, Sounds of Solidarity: Music, Race, and Spatial Entitlement in Los Angeles. And she uses this phrase, Constellation of Struggle, to describe the activism of different communities in Los Angeles in the 1940s and in the 1950s, right? Sites of activism that might not have shared a single vision, but that nonetheless were connected in various ways. And so the list that you see here is the list of schools, of sites where I can show you where some form of solidarity action with StandUpFG took place. In most of these cases, that action was a walkout. In some of these cases, that activism was virtual. But in all cases, right, it represents different moments, different locations in this much larger and shared struggle, right? Students, of course, again, articulate this connection and act on it in a couple of different ways. So let me share with you some of those. I could tell a story about each one of those high schools listed, but I want to just focus on this one here, because I find it really moving and meaningful, and in many ways relevant to the topic of this presentation. Glen High School, which is located on the west side of Hillsborough, the students who participated in the walkout there took it upon themselves to walk about 9 or so miles from their high school to the Forest Grove School District offices, where they would meet up with students from Forest Grove High School, right? And so there's some question about how many students actually completed this walk, right? We know that as of 11:20 in the morning on the day of the walkouts of May 19th, that some 25 or so students were making that walk. My understanding is that some of those students do get picked up by their parents and driven to the location, but many of them continue and by the afternoon are able to link up with those students at Forest Grove High School at the school district offices, where they carry out a rally and where the school district superintendent comes out and speaks in support of that movement. So I find this a really compelling example of solidarity, right? Of these students literally, traveling these 9 miles to stand with their peers at Forest Grove High School. Students, though, who participated in the walkout, whether it was at Forest Grove or elsewhere, they had other ways of articulating the sense of connection as well. Here we've got 2 images that speak to the solidarity that existed between students in different locations. And so the image on the left is a collage that includes images of walkouts and of protests in support of StandUpFG that took place at those various locations that I showed in the previous two slides ago, right? And the point is that, in this image, right, the student who created it, because these are all student-generated artifacts, has articulated these links, has drawn connections between these different movements, right, to show the kind of collective power that these students held. The image on the right, created by an FG student, Natalia Bremejo, also visualizes this idea of support and how students various high schools stood up with one another and in solidarity. I find this a really beautiful image in that it also speaks to that banner that had caused, in many ways, the original mobilization of students on May 18th, which had said, build a wall. And so the way that Natalia used the imagery of the wall to put together an altogether different message, I find really powerful. And so thinking about like the applications of StandUpFG in the classroom, right? Many of y'all are teachers. And I think that this would be a wonderful way of asking students to draw connections between these various struggles, right? And that could be having students dig a little bit deeper into one of those locations, right, to tell a story or a narrative about, for instance, what it is that took place at Glen Cove. And like I said, each one of these schools has a different and compelling story about how those students came to organize, the connections that they had to Forest Grove. And in each one of these cases, students articulated unique grievances, right? They understood and stood in solidarity with the students of Forest Grove, but they also used that as an opportunity to reflect on their own educational experiences, and particularly the experiences of racism and discrimination that they shared with those students at Forest Grove High School. So, whether, an assignment is built around kind of excavating the history of each one of these locations, or whether the assignment is about highlighting connections between them, right? I think that this is a space where the exhibition and the story of StandUpFG really lends itself, I think, to some creative applications in the classroom. I want to share another concept that has been kind of deeply shaped, that has deeply informed my thinking, not just about the exhibition, but in particular about the museo ambulante, or the walking museum, that'll go up in a couple of different locations that I'll share at the end of this presentation. And that is the Zapatista concept of preguntando, caminamos, right? Which might be translated as we walk, we question. And so I'm borrowing this description of this concept from a beautiful article from an anonymous author, Latinx Anónima, in which the author describes some of the challenges that they faced as a tenure track instructor. But I'll read here the passage. The concept of preguntando caminamos emerged at a historical moment when the indigenous communities of Chiapas, who had been evidencing the growing possessive impulse to restrict their freedom and movement, finally said, ya basta. Despite power's impulse to contain, to limit mobility, to restrict freedom, the Zapatista movement reminded the world that there exist creative ways in which everyday people are mobilizing and moving in resistance to power. So I find this idea really compelling, right? Creative ways in which everyday people are mobilizing and moving in resistance to power. And I see this in the actions of some of the students in StandUpFG. The image that I paired this with, which is also included in this article, is from Melanie Cervantes, and it includes this very powerful quotation from the Chicana feminist scholar Gloria Anzaldúa, which reads, "Caminante no hay puentes, se hacen puentes al andar." And so we might translate that as traveler, there are no bridges, we make bridges as we walk. And Anzaldúa is actually reworking a much older phrase in which puentes is replaced with paths or caminos, right? And part of, Gloria Anzaldúa wrote a beautiful essay, many of you are familiar with, This Bridge Called My Back, right? She's very much invested in this metaphor of building bridges, and in particular of the way in which women of color have been asked to build bridges, but different story for a different day. My point here, though, is that I'm very moved by this description of in the creative ways in which everyday people mobilize and resist power. And I think that as we look through the archive that students generated during the Forest Grove walkouts, right, we can see evidence of these creative ways of mobilizing. Let me share one example of that I find really powerful. This scene takes place not at Forest Grove High School, but instead at Westview High School. And you will see the president of Westview High School here address the students, and then students respond to this conversation. Well, it's a conversation of sorts, right? I'll play the video.
Amazing. This isn't what we're trying to do, Franco. We don't want you to be amazed by it. We don't want you to be amazed. We want you to talk. Right? You're saying you're diverse. I have never been respected by my culture. My ethnicity has never been respected in this field.
I see this as a really beautiful and powerful moment in which a student speaks back to power, right? And in particular, he speaks back to this idea that the administration, in this particular case at Westview High School, was supportive of the students simply because they valued diversity, right? And so here again, thinking about this concept of as we walk, we question, it's clear from this video that as students are participating in this walkout, as they're becoming aware of their power and of their voice, they're using that to question the ideas of administrators and other adults who either downplayed their activism or, right, tried to present it in a way that was something that they were proud of. And in the exhibition, I'm trying to be very careful to avoid, right, kind of amplifying the voices of school administrators and of journalists, and instead shifting the lens onto the voices of students. This is something that I've tried to do in this reconstruction of the exchange by highlighting the words of students. So both of these philosophies, right, of preguntando, caminamos, and of a constellation of struggle are kind of what's at the heart of the museo ambulante, or the walking museum that the folks at the museum and I are developing for this exhibition. And so the story of Museo Ambulante, you know, comes from, or rather is borrowing from, the story of the museum at our place, museum at my place, our place, that Five Oaks Museum has done in the past with the This is Kalapuyan Land exhibit, right? And so with This is Kalapuyan Land, the museum created these beautiful collection of printed yard signs that were located in various places outdoors, right? And so from that, I took the inspiration to create a yard sign exhibit that would be an outdoor and interactive component of the digital exhibition. And so, as you can see, there are some locations in the Tualatin Hills Parks and Recreation District, as well as at in the city of Forest Grove, where we will place these sets of 10 yard signs that will tell a different part of the story of StandUpFG. And I'm actually working with one of the folks who's in the audience today, Jeronimo Roldan, who's a PhD student at the University of Oregon, to create these really beautiful maps of not just the walkout locations, but also to use those locations to inform the placement of the Museo Ambulante. In other words, the reason that we've selected these locations to place the Museo Ambulante is because they're the places where we feel are adjacent to schools that have a high number of Latinx students and a very low number of Latinx teachers. And so in that sense, we hope that the Museo Ambulante can be, again, a way of kind of speaking back to that official history while also kind of creating this interactive component. We'll also use QR codes to allow folks to scan the printed yard signs with their phones, and in doing so, pull up different artifacts from the exhibition, as well as generate opportunities to interact with the exhibition. For instance, by reactivating the hashtag, right? Inviting participants to use the hashtag to reflect on their experiences of these Museo Ambulante. Because the Museo Ambulantes are all going to be placed in different locations, they will all be somewhat different as well, right? And so we're thinking of a way of encouraging folks to the degree that they're able to view these in different locations, because they all tell a different part of the story, right? And in doing so, right, we can get a kind of more complete and comprehensive sense of what it is that happened at StandUpFG. I've run out of slides to share. I also see that there's a bunch of stuff happening on the chat. And so maybe it's an appropriate place to stop here and see if there's not some questions there that I can answer. But also to give you all an invitation, maybe to ask questions, but also I'm curious like what y'all's connection is to StandUpFG. Yeah, can I maybe turn it over to you, Victoria?
You can absolutely turn it over to me. Thank you so much, Israel. Looks like we've already got a question in the chat. Jean is asking about when will the displays be up?
That's a great question. I'm really hoping that the displays will be up on October 2nd, which is also the day that we will have the opening virtual event for the exhibition. It's also the day that the exhibition website will go live. October 2nd is a really important day for Mexicanos. It's the anniversary of the mass student massacre that took place at Tlatelolco in November of 1968, right as the Olympics were set to get underway. And so, you know, we often, and I'm guilty of doing this as well, right? Think about the connection between activism today and activism in the 1960s, while kind of reinscribing borders, right? And students certainly are drawing inspiration from global movements. You know, there are student movements in Mexico City, there's student movements in Paris, France, all over the place, right? And so in selecting that date, I wanted also to open up an opportunity to reflect on kind of how the history of student activism in Mexico also is brought to bear on StandUpFG. And absolutely, Leslie, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint. As I had mentioned to Victoria right before we started, I want to do a little bit work to include some citations in there, but I'm happy to make that available to everyone and include those in learning resources for the exhibition. As you all can tell, the exhibition relies a lot on tweets, and I've got a collection of 900 or so tweets, which I'm calling student-generated historical artifacts. And that's also something that I would hope to make available to educators as well, right? Because I think that as a kind of a data set, right, as a historical archive, it's really valuable. And thinking about, maybe this is a place to talk about it, maybe not, thinking about place and space, right? Thinking about virtual space as a site of organizing as well. And so I'm hoping that that raw data of tweets will be something that educators will be able to use in different ways in their classroom to encourage students to really dig into that history and think critically. Yes, Teresa has typed out a question, not a question, but they're responding to my question about the connection to StandUpFG. Teresa says that my high school in Portland may have not held an action. I showed footage of FG walkout and discussed it with my students. Yeah, I think that this is also really interesting too, right? Like which schools did have actions and which didn't, and kind of like what counts as a solidarity action, right? In my research of the tweets, right, there are students who are lamenting the lack of a walkout in their school, right? Who are saying, I really wish that this was something that was taking place, but is not. And there's also places where, one tweet is the only evidence I have that a walkout took place at all, right? And so part of what I really find moving is to kind of compile all of this history in one place. Leslie had her hand up, and then I'll Katie or Victoria, do you want to do the questions? Sorry. This comes so natural, just the yeah, teacher vibe.
Actually, right? Katie was first.
There, thank you, Leslie.
Hi, thanks, Leslie, and thank you, everybody. I just wanted to ask just a couple of general questions. I teach at Beaverton High School, but I'm fairly new to Beaverton High School. But I'm also really happy to see several of my Beaverton colleagues are in this session right now. So there's quite a few Beaverton School District teachers in here. And I was just curious, what might be some suggestions, things that, I happen to be an art teacher, and I know there's a few other art teachers here, but there's also other content area teachers. What are some of the things that we might be able to do, especially as, a white teacher, that I might be able to do to support my students better with this? And you mentioned October 2nd in particular, but just some suggestions about how we might be able to support our students better with this, and to empower them, encourage them, to help educate them. I know many of my colleagues at the school also would love to support our students better. So any suggestions, or if you have something that you might be sending out to all of us, or, so that's my job.
I'm happy to do that, but the main suggestion is always to listen to your students, right? Because I can tell you what I think, but it's not, it doesn't mean the same as when it comes from students. And so I'm going to turn this over to Kadish. Kadish, I'm so happy that you're here. Kadish was a student in my History of Mexico class. She's also my research assistant on this project. All of those tweets from all of those different high schools, Kadish went through the entire list of them and separated them. And she's also an artist and a curator, and has a ton of experience. And so I'll let her answer, Katie, your question.
Yeah, so hi, nice to meet everyone. And I know there's a familiar face in this, my art teacher's in here. So yeah, so I think one of the most important things, especially like as a student of color, has always been just having support. I created an art exhibition senior year of high school that was focused all around immigration, especially since my parents are immigrants, all about DACA, and just having that support from teachers is one of the most important things. I've made so many connections just having teachers that have been around to just chat and talk, and especially when in 2016, when a lot of things were happening for the Latinx community, it was just really nice to know that, you know, you had your allies. And also just to educate yourself, I think is one of also very important thing for specifically people not of color. So just educating yourself, reading things, making sure you're understanding people's culture and their traditions and respecting it. I think those are one of the most important things that a teacher and a mentor could do for a student of color. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I couldn't have planned it better, right? The listening to students, whether that's, you know, digging through 900 of their tweets to try to get a sense of, you know, what meaning they assign to their actions, whether it's in this case. There's a question in the chat from John, which is a really important question. And yes, Leslie says, Kadish, you're amazing. Oh, your art teacher is in here? That's amazing. That's really cool. Kadish also has some art that she's going to be contributing to the exhibition. So when that opens up, be sure to check her out. Let's see. Yeah. So the question, John's question about like the difficulty in recruiting Latinx teachers, right? Really, really important question. The lack of Latinx teachers makes it difficult to recruit and keep Latinx educators. You speak to the number of Latinx individuals in the education pipeline and how we might not only recruit, but also keep Latinx teachers. That's a really good question. And I'm looking at Arturo, who is a former student of mine at PCC, who's also was a student in the Portland Teachers Program. And Arturo, am I right that you just wrapped up at PSU? Have you started teaching? Are you in the classroom now?
I'm actually just in the summer term of my grad program for my master's at GTEP at PSU.
What do you think of this question, Arturo? Why are there so few Latinx teachers, and what can we do about it?
I can only say from personal experience from the other Latinx teachers that I know, it's money. It's the difficulty to getting these resources to get into that master's program, to get into a university, to even with Portland Teachers Program, I got tuition waivers, but I'm going through PCC, PSU, and then PSU again. And it's just that the funding isn't there. And just having these pathways for specifically students of color to become educators is what's going to change it.
That's a great segue. Gabriel, are you in the room? Do you want to talk a little bit about the Critical Educators of Color pathway? If not, I'm happy to.
Hi, sure. I could turn on the video here. Sorry, that's my closet back there. But anyways, yeah, good to see everybody. Good to see you, Arturo. Thank you, Israel. The presentation is so powerful. I'm jotting down notes. This is amazing, and I appreciate all the work. And I know it's only beginning, which is just crazy. And thank you to all the activists and leaders that are in the room. I appreciate all of your work. We developed building on the movement that's here in our backyard in PCC. I co-developed with awesome colleagues at Pacific University, a critical educator of color pathway program. And following a cohort model, we have a dream budget. It's on paper all the way down to the T, but we're doing it with no funding, but it's a pathway. It's a structure to bring students of color into the teaching profession that anchors and centers ethnic studies and social justice through a critical feminist Chicanx lens, Latinx lens, borrowing from our ancestors, acknowledging the North-South global divide in pedagogical practices and partnerships, blurring the lines, if not blowing the lines up, that separate communities and centers of knowledge and who gets to produce knowledge. So a cohort model, 12 to 15 students per year through Pacific University. One of the differences, just really quick, is that students receive their undergraduate degree with a teaching license, and we're focusing on placing students and being intentional about where student graduates start their teaching career. It's dangerous to put a teacher in a school when they're going to be literally desegregating the teaching pool. We have to use it in these terms. So if we're going to desegregate a school, what's the school's commitment and game plan? And we're not just bringing one student in, one teacher in there for their first year of teaching. They're not going to be teaching anymore if they're desegregating a school by themselves without that acknowledgement and support. So we're looking at specific game plans and starting structurally Hillsborough, Forest Grove school districts. And when districts want to partner, we want to see their commitment and vision and game plan. What schools are safe for teachers of color to teach at, to start teaching at. We're not even just talking about pipelines. We're talking about safety, mental health, and physical health. They're correlated. So that's the Critical Educator Pathway Program. We have 11 students signed up that have been vetted and that are going to start in September. We're hoping to recruit a couple more for this cohort, and we're still, like Arturo said, where we are behind is the funding, but we're working towards that. But yeah.
That's really powerful, Gabriel. Thank you. And thank you also for all of that labor, right? Gabriel is out in the community connecting with, folks from the different schools in Hillsborough and Forest Grove, building that partnership with Pacific, and all, with the idea of actualizing the vision of education that students articulated during the walkout. Alex, please.
I'm just really excited about this work. I grew up in the Hillsborough area. My family were migrant farmers. They settled there around the 70s, when all of this culture building and this community building started. And I'm just really excited to see what's going to happen in Portland. I recently just relocated to Seattle for a Dean of Students job, but want to keep in touch with you because I'm starting my PhD program at Pacific, and I want to keep in touch about this critical teacher preparation program, because potentially maybe a teacher assistant in a few of those classes. So hoping we can connect on that end.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And Alex is one of a handful of folks who you will see in a lot of the photographs of the walkouts and the actions that come afterwards, right? So thinking about that kind of intergenerational connection, right? Alex and Byron's son and so many other folks out in the community, right? Eddie Bolaños, who's not here, but who played a really important role in helping to support the youth, right? And so I'm really grateful, Alex, to you. And this is really beautiful, the way that we're kind of doing this by committee. I couldn't have imagined a better outcome to the question and answer session. Yeah, John says no funding, but we can change that too, right? Gabriel has an incredible model for how to do that. The students, this is something that I found really powerful, right? After the walkout takes place, right, the next step for the students is to meet collectively, and they do so at Centro Cultural de Washington County in Cornelius. They gather there with community leaders, Juan Carlos Gonzalez, Maria Caballero Rubio, some other folks in the community, and they start to talk about, like, what do we want? We've just created this walkout, this beautiful movement. Thousands of students have participated. I can't put my finger on it, but I think somewhere around 5, 8, maybe 10,000 students participated in this, right? And so the question is, like, what do you do next? And I've got this beautiful image that you all will see in the exhibition where the students literally took a vote. They put a big poster board on the wall, and they took stickers and they voted on which one of these demands they thought would be most meaningful. And the thing that students came to the most often, the number one thing they voted for in that meeting that they thought would change the schools, was to implement ethnic studies, right? Was to change the curriculum, And shortly thereafter that, right, Oregon passes that historic state bill. And so the story of StandUpFG is very much also part of the story of the movement for ethnic studies on the West Side. And it links up with the story of organizations like APANO and of NAYA and of other really important groups that are doing that work on the West Side, on the East Side, excuse me. But collectively, right, that is the student pressure that results in the passage of the nation's first law requiring ethnic studies standards to be embedded in social studies curriculum, which I think is really powerful. Katie, I'm really excited to see these collaborations. I'm glad that like this is one of the outcomes of this session. Lauren, you've got a question, please.
Yeah, hi. Hey, thank you. I'm really excited about this event, and I teach middle school in Beaverton at Meadow Park Middle School, so it's close to Cedar Park. And I'm wondering if did a lot of the youth organizing happen in like mechas and other student groups within high schools, or like how did that organizing happen? Because I was earlier when you were talking, you were showing one of the slides of the images of the walkouts, and you mentioned like having students like find out more about the stories of the different schools, I think is what it was. So one is, yeah, did a lot of the organizing happen through mechas or different groups? And then also how can students find out more and do that research? Because sometimes, especially as a middle school teacher, I have to kind of scaffold that work too. And like sometimes I'll provide a collection of resources like videos and different media that they can look at. But then, yeah, so how can they find out more?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually don't know what happens at each one of those. There's just too many of them, right? And they've all got their own kind of story. But what I've been able to gather is mostly through the tweets, right? And so, this collection of tweets that we'll make available as a spreadsheet might really be that resource that you're thinking of, because you can say to a student, here are all the tweets that mention Westview High School. Tell me the story of StandUpFG at Westview High School, right? They could also do that artistically, right? I've got a student, I've got a collaborator. Her name is Precious Romo. She's a graduate of Reed College, recent graduate, and she's putting together a comic book where each page represents visually, right, what took place at each one of these 6 locations that she's identified, right? So, I think that Twitter's a really incredible resource, right? You could literally search hashtag StandUpFG and then the name of any school, and it'll pull up all of those tweets, right? I also, spend a lot of time reading through some newspapers, right? So, again, that's a teaching resource that I'm happy to make available of, here are 5, 6, 7 local newspaper articles that mention something about each one of these locations that students can use as a primary source. But I'm happy to support anyone who wants to find ways to integrate the website, the exhibition, the museo ambulante into their curriculum, because that's why I made this, right? I'm not an artist, I'm not a curator, I'm a teacher, I'm an educator, and that's really the point of view from which I approach this. Alex, please.
Sorry, I was trying to look for a link also, but I know for when my students, so I was a Mecha advisor at Liberty High School at the time when this occurred. And we're having a lot of discussions about what the upcoming election would hold for our students and their families. So that was a very sensitive area. And there was a lot of students that have this justified anger and this passion that they really want to push forward. But I remember getting a call from one of my students at 2:30 in the morning, and they're like, this is going on. What do we do? And they just wanted to move towards action. And I know particularly in the Hillsborough area, Hillsborough High School and Liberty, those student bodies connected a lot. And there was, following that, there was some organization at the Hillsborough Brookwood Library. We met at Focused Home. I was, maybe I crossed a little bit of the boundaries as an educator, but I think it's important. But, and particularly, I think it was interesting because there's a lot of pushback internally. There's a lot of support from our administrators in the area, but behind closed doors, that wasn't so true. I remember I was interviewed by the Hillsborough Police Department, which was odd. I got a call in the middle of work and I was like, what? there's this assumption that there was like adults putting students up to doing this, but that wasn't the case. This was student powered. And it's just amazing to see. But I did want to share, so I am the board chair of a local nonprofit, the Chicana Alliance. And we host a summer program for incoming ninth graders. And a part of that is Latinx, Chicanx studies, where we focus on this particular area on the stand-up First Grove and advocating for yourself, and how do you find that resilience and that power to push where it's justified and change what you believe is right. But I put that link there. We've kind of been on a hiatus for the last couple of years due to COVID, but we're currently revamping our curriculum, and yeah, we'd be excited to get the word out so we can continue to have students there.
It's incredible. You could see what Alex is talking about in the tweets, right? That the night before, there are students from Hillsborough High, from Liberty, that are tweeting like, hey, we're going to do this thing. We're going to walk out tomorrow. And it's going to happen at the same time that the Forest Grove students walk out. And there are other locations where the walkout happens a little bit later. And it's clear that like they see this on social media and that they respond, right? So that's what I mean also by like the story looks different based on where we are, based on the space their students occupy, based on the relationships that they might have with students in other places, right? This connection between the students at Glen and the students at Forest Grove, or those that Alex is talking about, the organizing that happens, you know, offline and in people's houses, and that you know kind of is the grease that makes this all work. Yeah, thank you, Alex. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Okay, what's the last thing I wanted to mention? Okay, yeah, the exhibition will have a lot of interesting and I think really cool interactive components. And I want to just kind of shout one out right now because it'll come up soon. And I want to make sure that everybody in this room has a chance to share it out maybe with folks who you think might be interested. I'm working with singer-songwriter Joaquin Lopez, who was recently named one of the 2 creative laureates for the city of Portland, to lead a community workshop where folks will be invited to write a corrido, or a lyrical ballad telling the story of StandUpFG. So we'll do this over 2 workshops, one of which will take place on August 28th. The other one is September 4th, both Saturdays, from 2 to 3:30, and they'll take place at Centro Cultural. We'll limit how many folks can be at the location based on you know, COVID guidelines, but also ask folks to mask up. But you know, we'll be there collaboratively writing this ballad that will also be shared on the website, and thinking about like what you can use in the classroom, right? That's also an activity that I'd be happy to work with educators to help you develop, right? And it's something Kadish has done, Arturo has done it in my History of Mexico class, where I invite students to write a ballad using a really simple formula that creates these really beautiful cultural productions that speak not only to that history, but also reflect students' own lived experience. Victoria has just dropped the link to those events on the chat. Cool. All right, Victoria, is there anything else we want to shout out?
Shout out to everyone for being here today. And it was amazing to see how the Q&A session worked with everyone, you know, sharing their knowledge and experiences. That was awesome. I do have to end us with a donation plug, so stay tuned for this. Let's see. I've got to get the link ready. Here it comes.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So there will be the museo ambulante will be up, and then did you say the website will also have links to more resources? Or
I sure hope so. Yeah, the exhibition will be like really broad. There will be art, there will be narrative, there will be storytelling, there will be a link to a video of us making that song, the lyrical ballad. But yeah, my hope is also that there are some learning resources. And Victoria, maybe you can speak to a little bit more about what those might look like.
Yeah, absolutely. We put together learning resources that go with all of our exhibitions that sort of guide students of various ages to focus in on different aspects of the exhibition and specifically like ask reflection questions. So as they look at a page, they can think about the questions. And then they also come with art activities that are inspired by the artworks in the exhibition. And yes, the website link is not live yet. It's coming out on October 2nd. So in just 2 months, it's coming out. And the Museo Ambulante as well. We will have much more information about those to come. And
excited to see all the enthusiasm though. Yeah, it's really neat, y'all.
I know, we've had this event sort of coming before the exhibition opens so that we can line up with the educators on conference. Which, yeah, there are lots more resources on that page, not related to this exhibition, but other exciting things going on at the museums in the area. All right, so here comes my link. So please consider making a donation at the link. Five Oaks Museum, as an independent nonprofit, relies on the generosity of supporters to sustain our guest curator program, to put on the exhibitions like #StandUpFG, and to extend our access to free learning, putting out those learning materials at free and sliding scale costs so that everyone can access them. And fun bonus is that monthly donors of just $5 and more receive a complimentary essential membership. Fun! All right, thank you everyone so much for being here today. And have a nice rest of your Monday.
Thank you everyone. Arturo, Katie, so good to see y'all. Thanks for coming through.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.